In Chapter 1 of The Will to Believe by William James, the author introduces his argument that it is sometimes rational and permissible for a person to believe something without sufficient evidence. He begins with an overview of two different approaches people take when deciding whether or not they should accept certain beliefs: tough-minded empiricism, which requires absolute proof before accepting any belief, and tender-minded fideism, which allows one to embrace faith in spite of uncertainty. James then argues that neither approach can be completely correct because both have their own limitations. Empiricists are too rigid while fideists lack objectivity. Instead, he proposes a third option called the will to believe, where individuals make decisions about what they want, or need, to believe based on personal values rather than empirical facts alone. This idea has implications beyond religious matters as well. According to James, we often must choose between competing hypotheses even if there isn't enough data available yet for us to determine definitively which one is true or false. In such cases, our decision may depend more upon how much value each hypothesis holds for us personally than anything else, thus making this type of choice ultimately subjective but still potentially reasonable under certain circumstances. In Chapter 2 of The Will to Believe, William James examines the sentiment of rationality. He argues that there is a certain feeling or emotion associated with being rational and making decisions based on reason rather than faith. This sentiment can be seen in everyday life when people make choices about their lives. They often feel more comfortable if those choices are backed up by evidence and logical reasoning. Furthermore, this same sentiment applies to religious beliefs as well. Many individuals find it easier to accept something as true if it has been proven through scientific inquiry or philosophical argumentation instead of simply taking someone's word for it without any proof whatsoever. Finally, James concludes that while we may not always agree on what constitutes rationality in all cases, especially regarding religion, our shared sense of its importance should still guide us towards better decision-making overall, both personally and collectively speaking. In Chapter 3 of The Will to Believe, William James examines the ethical implications of belief. He argues that it is not only permissible but also necessary for us to believe in certain things without sufficient evidence or proof. According to him, we must be willing and able to make decisions based on our beliefs even if they are unsupported by facts or logic, because this allows us to live meaningful lives with purpose and direction. Furthermore, he claims that there can never be absolute certainty when making such choices, as all knowledge is ultimately subjective. Thus one should accept a degree of risk when forming their convictions about life's important questions. In addition, James suggests that faith has an essential role in human progress since it encourages people towards action rather than stagnation due solely from fear-based reasoning, which often leads nowhere productive at best and disaster at worst. In Chapter 4 of The Will to Believe, William James examines the dilemma posed by determinism. He argues that if we accept a deterministic view of reality, then our beliefs and actions are predetermined and thus not under our control. However, he also claims that this does not necessarily mean free will is an illusion, as it may be possible for us to make choices in spite of being determined. To illustrate his point further, James uses examples from physics such as Newton's laws, which describe how objects move but do not determine their motion or direction. In addition, he discusses the idea that while some aspects of life may be predetermined, there can still exist room for choice within those parameters. Just because something has been decided doesn't mean one cannot choose what they want out of it or act differently than expected based on past experience/knowledge, etc. Finally, James concludes with a discussion about faith. Even though determinism might suggest everything is already set in stone, so to speak, and therefore no real freedom exists, believing otherwise allows us hope and possibility, two things essential when striving towards any goal worth achieving. In Chapter 5 of The Will to Believe, William James examines theism as a hypothesis. He argues that it is not irrational or unreasonable for an individual to believe in God and suggests that such belief can be justified on pragmatic grounds. According to James, if one believes in God, then they will have greater emotional satisfaction than those who do not. This makes believing more attractive from a practical standpoint, even though there may be no scientific evidence supporting its truthfulness. Furthermore, he claims that religious faith has been beneficial throughout history by providing individuals with moral guidance and comfort during difficult times, something which science cannot provide. Finally, he concludes by asserting that while we should never accept any proposition without sufficient proof or justification, as doing so would lead us into error, neither should we reject propositions simply because they are unprovable at present. Instead, we must weigh up all available evidence before making our decision about what is true and false. In Chapter 6 of The Will to Believe, William James examines the reality of unseen forces and phenomena. He argues that there is a certain amount of evidence for such things as telepathy, spiritualism, miracles, and other supernatural occurrences which cannot be explained by science or reason alone. He suggests that these experiences are real in some sense but may not always be verifiable through scientific means. To support his argument, he cites examples from history where people have experienced events beyond what can normally be seen with our senses or understood logically, including religious conversions, visions during prayerful meditation, and even cases where physical healing has occurred without any medical intervention whatsoever. Finally, he concludes by saying that although we should remain open-minded about such matters, it would also be wise to exercise caution when considering them, since they could potentially lead us astray if taken too seriously without proper investigation into their validity first. In Chapter 7, James examines the idea of a divided self. He argues that there are two distinct selves within us, one which is conscious and rational, and another which is unconscious or irrational. The former can be seen as our true self, while the latter represents our instinctive desires and impulses. According to James, these two sides must work together in order for an individual to make decisions effectively. If either side dominates too much, then it will lead to confusion or paralysis when making choices. To illustrate this point, he uses examples from literature such as Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where each character embodies different aspects of human nature, good versus evil respectively, showing how they struggle against each other yet ultimately need balance in order for harmony between them both, and thus peace within oneself. Ultimately though, despite their differences, both parts still form part of who we are, so neither should be ignored completely but rather embraced with understanding instead. In Chapter 8, James argues that theism is a reasonable belief and should be accepted as such. He begins by noting how common sense has been used to support both sides of religious debates throughout history. On one hand, it can be argued that religion requires faith in something beyond what we know through experience. On the other hand, many people have found comfort and solace in their beliefs about God or gods without any scientific proof for them being true. To reconcile these two views, he suggests an approach which allows us to accept certain aspects of our experiences while still allowing room for doubt when necessary. Let your credulity take its chance along with your incredulity, James. This means accepting some things based on intuition rather than evidence, but also leaving open possibilities if new information arises later down the line. He then goes into detail regarding why this kind of attitude towards life makes more sense than either complete acceptance or rejection of all forms of religious thought, namely because there are too many unknowns involved with trying to prove anything definitively right now, so instead we must rely upon our own judgment calls at times, even though they may not always turn out correct eventually due to lack knowledge/evidence available today. In addition, he notes how those who reject everything related spirituality often do so from fear, whether it's fear death itself or simply uncertainty over future events, whereas believers tend to embrace possibility, hope despite potential risks associated, believing blindly, ultimately concluding his argument stating the only way make sure you don't miss truth is keep yourself receptive every suggestion, James. In Chapter 9, James examines the relationship between theism and pragmatism. He argues that a belief in God is not necessarily irrational or illogical, rather it can be seen as an expression of faith which has practical value for those who believe. Furthermore, he suggests that religious beliefs may provide comfort to individuals facing difficult situations by providing them with hope and assurance about their future prospects. Additionally, James claims that religion provides moral guidance through its teachings on right conduct and justice, something which cannot always be found elsewhere in life's experiences. Finally, he concludes his argument by asserting that although there are many different interpretations of what constitutes true religion, and thus true belief, ultimately each individual must decide for themselves whether they find any particular set of beliefs meaningful enough to live according to them. In Chapter 10 of The Will to Believe, William James examines the relationship between humanism and theism. He argues that both are necessary for a full life, one without the other is incomplete. Humanists focus on this world while theologians look beyond it, but each has something valuable to offer in terms of understanding our place in existence. For example, he suggests that religious faith can provide comfort during times of suffering or difficulty by offering hope for an afterlife where justice will be served and wrongs righted. On the other hand, secular values such as freedom from superstition and reliance upon reason have enabled humanity to make great strides forward technologically and socially over time, progress which would not have been possible if we had remained mired in outdated beliefs about gods or fate controlling our lives instead of taking responsibility ourselves through science-based inquiry into natural laws governing reality around us. Ultimately, though, James concludes that neither approach should dominate exclusively since they complement each other so well when taken together, allowing individuals access both spiritual solace plus practical solutions needed to tackle everyday problems faced here on Earth. In Chapter 11 of The Will to Believe, William James examines theism and immortality. He begins by noting that belief in God is a common feature among many religions, but he argues that it should not be taken as an article of faith without further examination. To this end, he outlines 3 arguments for the existence of God: firstly, from design, secondly, from morality, and thirdly, from religious experience. With regard to each argument, James notes both its strengths and weaknesses before concluding with his own opinion on whether or not they are convincing enough evidence for believing in a deity's existence. In addition to discussing these philosophical issues related to religion, James also considers how one might go about proving, or disproving, life after death through scientific means such as psychical research experiments which seek out paranormal phenomena like ghosts or telepathy, etc. Ultimately, however, he concludes that while there may be some circumstantial evidence pointing towards survival beyond physical death, ultimately we cannot know anything definitively until our time comes when we can personally verify if any afterlife exists at all. In Chapter 12 of The Will to Believe, William James examines theism and mysticism. He begins by discussing how religious beliefs are often based on personal experience rather than rational argument or scientific evidence. He then goes on to discuss various forms of mystical experiences that have been reported throughout history, including visions, trances, and other altered states of consciousness. Finally, he argues that these kinds of experiences can provide a basis for belief in God even if they cannot be scientifically verified or logically explained away as mere illusions or hallucinations. In conclusion, he suggests that faith is an essential part of religion because it allows us to accept certain truths without necessarily understanding them fully. In Chapter 13 of The Will to Believe, William James examines theism and religion. He begins by noting that religious beliefs are often based on faith rather than evidence or logical argumentation. This is because many aspects of life cannot be explained through scientific inquiry alone, thus, it may be necessary for individuals to rely upon their own subjective experiences in order to form a belief system about these matters. James then goes on to discuss how different forms of theism can provide an individual with meaning and purpose in life as well as offering comfort during times of suffering or distress. Additionally, he argues that even if one does not believe in God per se, they can still benefit from engaging with spiritual practices such as prayer, which have been found helpful by countless people throughout history regardless of their particular theological views. Finally, he concludes his chapter by emphasizing the importance for each person's journey towards understanding themselves better should include some kind of reflection upon questions related both science and spirituality alike so that we might gain insight into our place within this vast universe we inhabit together here today, now more interconnected than ever before. In conclusion, while there will always remain much debate over what constitutes true religion, if any, ultimately it is up us all individually decide whether certain ideas resonate deeply enough within ourselves warrant further exploration, something only time itself shall tell.